I'm happy to be introducing our speakers today in collaboration with the Center for Global Security Research. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Berejikian, who will be part of the presentation. He is the Josiah Meigs Distinguished Teaching Professor at the University of Georgia and a Senior Fellow at the Center for Trade and Security. He does research on cognitive science, foreign policy decision-making, and has been published in American Political Science Review, Political Psychology, and the Journal of Conflict Resolution. His research focuses on prospect theory and deterrence, and he has worked and has been referenced in the Department of Defense Deterrence Operation Joint Operating Concept, also known as the DOJOC, which was published back in 2006. Also, we have Dr. Zachary Zwald, who is on the faculty at in the Department of Political Science at University of Houston. His research focuses on the relationship between technological development, military doctrine, and strategy. And he is the Associate Director of the University of Houston Center for International and Comparative Studies and the Director of the university's degree minor in National Security Studies. Earlier in his career, Zach was an assistant professor at the Air War College and also at the U.S. Air Force Center for Unconventional Weapons Studies. And I have had the pleasure of working with Zach over the last few years when I was in the Pentagon as well as here at Lawrence Livermore. So it's good to have you back. So with that, we're going to start with Dr. Zwald, and then we'll switch to Dr. Berejikian, and then back to Dr. Zwald. So please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Well, thanks very much, guys, for having us out today. Always nice to get back to California. This is where I'm born and raised, about 40 miles away from here. And so what Jeff and I will present for today is the initial results that we've collected after a one-year study funded by DITRA's PASC program. And we're really looking forward to, one, putting these results in front of folks and getting your feedback. So with that, I'm just going to jump right in. Okay, so the overarching relationship that we really wanted to drill down on is this big core one of deterrence. What is the relationship between risk disposition and deterrence decision making? And just to clarify here, when we talk about risk disposition, we're talking about one's willingness to run the risk, whatever they may be, associated with deterrence bargaining during these immediate deterrence crises. And when we think about it, it's usually on the scale of risk acceptance to aversion. On the other side, what is deterrence decision making? We're talking about one's preferences for signaling. So how does one determine whether to concede, stand firm, or escalate? We kind of artificially narrowed the options for our experiments, as you'll see, to just standing firm or an escalatory signal. But so the relationship we're looking at today is how does one's variability in risk disposition between aversion and acceptance change one's preferences between standing firm or sending this escalatory signal. And so when we first got together and started thinking about this, we said, well, where do we start? And there was a lot, as we'll kind of, maybe that's an overall theme of what my part of the presentation. While we have a lot of strong intuitions out there, we don't have a lot of strongly empirically grounded theories about this relationship. So we just decided to take 4 of the factors that are perhaps most widely viewed as having a strong impact on this relationship and try to figure out how to factor them into the model. So the first one we looked at, and this is our primary causal factor that we examined, that's decision frame. Plainly said, how does changing the description of outcomes from a potential policy, deterrence policy signal affect one's risk processing? This is rooted in prospect theory, has a whole host of robust findings across different types of policy areas, but hasn't been as much applied to tested in the deterrence context. We'll get into this much more. And then we looked at threat clarity. So the Deterrence Operations Joint Operating Concept, I'll say DOJOC from now on, as well as other documents that we'll mention, assume that there is some strong relationship between threat clarity varying between clear and explicit threats and these ambiguous all options on the table threats. But That's an open empirical question. Conflict domain. How does the domain in which you are in, chemical, conventional, nuclear, cyber, how does that shift one's willingness to run risks, if at all? And then a really cool one, just in terms of gaining insight on these differences, is experience. And we define experience as military experience, and more specifically, familiarity, level of familiarity with military operations and deterrence concepts. To what extent does that level of familiarity affect one's willingness to run risks in the deterrence space? Okay, so I spent a few years working amongst military folks, and this is my biggest takeaway is if I didn't do this, I lost people at Go. So the bluff here is we are aiming to establish a foundation, an empirically based foundation for this relationship between risk disposition and deterrence signaling. We're trying to do basic science on deterrence decision making as a way of incrementally building toward a better understanding of risk and therefore, at some point, policy implications. And our starting point, and what we reveal, I think, to a large extent in this study, is that there were significant gaps in our understanding about how this relationship plays out. That there are a lot of strong intuitions out there about these different 4 factors that I mentioned and how they factor into one's risk taking. But when you start listing them all, as I've now done a number of times, you start finding that different camps don't always have clear causal hypotheses. And if they do, there are multiple. And then if you look at the theories undergirding them, how and why things happen as they're hypothesized to, is they're weak and there are gaps. And then when you look at the empirics, oftentimes these haven't been shored up through actual empirical testing. So in this state of things, where you have conceptual gaps and you have empirical gaps, we decided that the experimental route was the best way to proceed. And this is just an initial take to eventually build the data so we can have a multi-method dialogue. And other ways of doing this, that are common within political science and international relations. The case study method has often been the one where people have employed that to understand deterrence decision making. And that does and can do a great job at understanding the nuance of what people are thinking, but doesn't allow you to control for all these factors and isolate causal effects. Large N studies, as Jeff will reference his own work in this area, have a definite important place in this dialogue, and they can control for factors, but they don't allow us to get at what people were thinking. So the experimental method, at least at this initial stage, the stylized version of these deterrence decision-making scenarios was sort of the Goldilocks method that we chose to employ to get this off the ground. And at the end of the presentation, what we hope to show you is, what we will show you, is that our data contributes to this evidence-based policy dialogue that most of the people in the room, I think are very aware. Typically, these conversations about how the United States should proceed in terms of force structure and doctrine as it relates to deterrence writ large, nuclear in specific, get very theological. And people speak past each other based on these finally deeply ingrained beliefs. And so we're hoping to sort of provide a set of criteria that can bridge these divides over these what have typically been theological debates. In the near term, the implications that we can show today are how our findings on risk processing qualify understandings of the drivers of deterrent stability, and that this has some really interesting implications for how we consider next generation US force structure decisions. And in the long term, once we can start expanding our study into cross-national analysis, then we can start building leading indicators of when people undergo risky loss frame shifts, and eventually perhaps start building counter-framing strategies to restabilize deterrence relationships in that way. Okay, so the general overview for today is I'm going to spend a few more minutes laying out the project motivations, and that's basically just kind of clarifying the state of the art on risk disposition and deterrence decision making on those 4 factors I mentioned, identifying the gaps so that we can provide some context for Jeff's data analysis section. He's going to get into the details on our experimental design and what we found, and then I'll jump back in for some conversations of linking that to policy and more depth about next steps. Okay, so these project motivations. Risk disposition. When we look at this, there are two big camps that we entertained in our research design. The conventional wisdom out there, what we take to be the conventional wisdom, is that risk disposition is an inherent trait. We typically talk about leaders or states as risk acceptant or risk averse, or perhaps more nuanced as leaning toward acceptance or aversion. But the notion is typically, if you look at a lot of different US policy documents for the last 3-4 administrations, that you see a notion that past behaviors are reliable indicators for current and future risk disposition, right? So a lot of these documents throughout the Bush 43 and Obama administrations talked about this class of somewhat bad actors that had done things like pursue WMD, violated norms and international laws and treaties in pursuit of those weapons, harmed their own people, spoke very aggressively, used weapons against their neighbors. These various behaviors of these states reliably indicate that they are risk acceptant actors now and when we meet them in the future, which has big implications for doctrine and force structure, right? An alternative way of looking at this is that risk disposition is frame dependent. And this is rooted in prospect theory, right? And Jeff will go into more depth in that in a few minutes, but in short, what this says and what Kahneman and Tversky found in 1979 and what's been replicated in the decades since is that how you frame, how you word the implications of particular policies, the outcomes of policies, whether you describe them in terms of gains or losses, benefits or costs, just that wording can shift one's risk disposition, irrespective of the facts on the ground. So as I mentioned, this causal mechanism is well demonstrated in many different areas, not so much in deterrence. So there's a lot of statistical work and qualitative work, but in terms of empirically demonstrating that decision-making follows these same patterns, we didn't quite have that. And when we look at the inherent risk disposition arguments, there's very little theoretical or empirical foundations for why these particular behaviors of bad actors should necessarily result in risk acceptance in a deterrence scenario. The next one we got into was threat clarity. So the DOJOC laid out this thing that, yeah, we need to build on prospect theory. And one of the big implications of prospect theory is that once we can figure out whether we're dealing with a risk acceptant or averse actor, then we know what sort of threat to throw at them. And more specifically, so said this document, if we were dealing with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, then maybe those ambiguous all options on the table threats, they may work. But today, we're not. Today, we tend to be dealing with these risk acceptant actors. And in this situation, now we need to turn up the dial on clarity and explicit nature and repercussions in terms of threatening them. So that was articulated in 2006. In the most recent National Defense Strategy, the same logic that some of the status quo powers, China, Russia, are going to respond to risk differently than, say, Iran or North Korea, that same logic is still present there. But the conceptual linkages between that threat clarity and risk disposition relationship are weak, minimal, and no one had tested that yet. Experience. So we looked at US civilians, members of the public, and we looked at military officers from major through general officer who were attending a professional military education institution last year. And the conventional wisdoms out there are that this type of military experience, this familiarity with military operations and deterrence concepts, has two big effects. One effect is in terms of stability. These actors are seen as being more stable in the risk preferences, or to put it in another way, less susceptible to the framing bias than the average member of the public. And the other aspect of where experience affects risk processing comes from a lot of the international relations work on the use of military force. And it says that those who have military service tend to be more risk averse in decisions about using military force than those that don't, right? So couple cool things here in terms of a research project are we don't know to what extent, if any, the civ-mil data on use of military force carries over into deterrence decision-making. And in terms of susceptibility to framing, the behavioral decision-making literature itself is somewhat mixed on that. So some literature has shown that those with expert training, and again, that's a very difficult thing to wrap one's head around exactly defining that measure, but when you look at what most people agree is an expert knowledge set, some people find that they do have more stable risk preferences. However, that is in contrast to a lot of behavioral decision-making, which has found that experts in medicine, in finance, are just as susceptible to the whole host of cognitive biases that we find replicated among lay people in these fields. So, open empirical question. Conflict domain. While we all right now think that domain matters, that one, it's an important organizing principle to look at things in terms of conventional, chemical, nuclear, cyber, space. In terms of the question that Jeff and I are interested in, how does this affect risk processing? We don't know, right? This is particularly pressing when now multi-domain stability, cross-domain deterrence dynamics, those are the pressing concerns for the US policymaking community. So we thought it's really pressing at this point then to know, does simply shifting the domain that one is in have any demonstrable effect on how they process risks? Okay, with that I'm going to hand things off to Jeff, and he's going to go into framing.
Okay, we thought that before moving into the experiment and talking about our results, that it would be helpful to kind of walk through the logic of behavioral decision theory with the use of kind of a stylized example to get a kind of concrete idea about what we mean by framing and how framing or reframing information can affect our preferences. So as Zach mentioned, the idea here is that by describing in different ways the exact same set of objective facts, we often see rather dramatic shifts in how people make decisions broadly. In our case, we're interested in shifts with respect to risk disposition. So a stylized example. This is the classic Asian disease problem that was posited by behavioral economists some 30, 35 years ago. And the idea here is that we are asked to consider a hypothetical disease that will kill some number of people. And we're also asked to consider two strategies, in this case vaccines. Vaccine A is a known conservative strategy. We know how many of the affected individuals it will save. Vaccine B, think of it as a risky experimental drug. We are less certain about how effective it will be. It could either save everybody, it might not save anybody, and for that reason we think of this as the riskier option. Notice that we've described these two strategies in terms of their benefits, in terms of their gains. But we could have just as easily described the exact same set of facts in terms of the bad things that happen, in terms of the losses. In this case, the metric is lives. Now, from the point of view of a good rational decision maker, this reframing doesn't make any difference because the two frames present exactly the same information. The only thing that varies here is the level of risk attached to the two strategies. So if you are inherently a risk-averse person, you might prefer strategy A regardless of how we frame the information. If you are, for whatever reason, inherently risk acceptant, you might sort of swing for the fences and prefer strategy B regardless of how we frame the information. Another way of saying this is that whatever your inherent level of risk disposition, whatever your thoughts or feelings are about risk, how you frame the information shouldn't affect your judgment. What's interesting is that we almost never find that to be the case. So cognitive science and framing research has demonstrated pretty clearly that our risk disposition, our tolerance for risks, is significantly what we call frame dependent. So when options and strategies are framed in terms of the benefits, people tend to be risk averse. They prefer sure things over riskier gambles. When you reframe those same things, those outcomes, in terms of the costs or negative consequences, people tend to take gambles and swing for the fences. This, we think, has clear implications for deterrence decision making. And I guess our point right now is that this isn't a new idea to cognitive science. It's not our idea. We want to share with you that this idea of frame dependence for risk is now considered to be a kind of a foundational concept in cognitive science with respect to how human beings make decisions. There is a great deal of sort of empirical work on this. There's some conceptual work. I'll talk about this in just a second. But we now think of frame dependence as a fundamental decision human trait. And for this reason, we think it extends to deterrence decisions as well. So we've got 30 years of cognitive science that has reaffirmed this basic result, right? We have framing as a foundational concept in behavioral economics. So it enjoys considerable external validity. Behavioral economists have framed everything from stock market behavior to your choice, literally your choice in pizza toppings. And we find consistent results. We're also beginning to see practical applications based on this research. So again, to stock market behavior, many of you are probably familiar with the stock market circuit breakers that kick in when sell-offs start to look like they're getting a little bit out of control. The purpose of those circuit breakers is to stop or halt the formation of loss frames that produce these really violent risk acceptance sell-offs. And they're actually pretty effective at that. So we've gone from the laboratory to the real world. For foreign policy scholars, the concepts of framing and foreign policy risk are well established, and we want to point your attention to just a specific subset of those. We now have, just recently and for the first time, empirical evidence from observational studies of state behavior that tell us pretty clearly that reframing, particularly loss framing, affects state behavior. It produces risky escalatory behavior with respect to conflict, and it undermines deterrent stability in the real world. Now, these results are different than what we're presenting today. We've got some backup slides, though, if we want to talk about some of that. But for all of these reasons, we think we're on solid conceptual ground. So the question is, how do we build all this into an experiment? This is just a kind of summary of our experimental design. I'm not sure, but here on the outside here, we've got kind of our survey flow. We used a randomized design, and so for those of you who might do experiments, randomization is kind of the gold standard for making causal inferences because it allows us to control for any of the outside factors that might affect a decision and allows us to sort of just focus on the variables that we're interested in. And so we manipulate the framing variable here in the first stage. We manipulate the threat clarity variable here in the second stage. We account for and control for the impact of domain by repeating the same experiment across multiple domains. And we control for or account for experience, as Zach suggested, and I'll talk about this in a minute, deploying these experiments on two very different samples. On the right-hand side here is just a kind of a summary of the content. And again, we have backup slides if you're interested. But the idea here is that subjects are given information about a U.S. Deterrence crisis. All the scenarios involve extended deterrence. And after reading through that information, we sort of provided them with two choices. One was a deterrence choice, sort of do you want to reaffirm the existing deterrence posture? The second choice is an escalatory gamble. And our main treatment here is that we reframed how we describe the consequences of those policies in a way that I just described with respect to framing. And then we asked people to make a choice, and it's those choices that we're most interested in. Very quickly, this is just a brief discussion of our sample. So the experience sample, about 300 active duty U.S. military officers across a range of PME institutions. All the services are represented, some interesting variation in domain-specific experience. And then we think of this as either a control or an experience sample, a demographically representative sample in the US. And comparing the results of these two samples allows us to drill down even more on the role that experience might play in deterrence judgments, and for us in particular, risk. I'm going to skip through this slide very quickly, but we have a number of motivated hypotheses. This is just the one about framing, and the idea here is we would expect the proportion of escalation to be greater when we frame things in terms of loss. That is, when we reframe the exact same facts on the ground. in terms of loss. The null is that we shouldn't see a difference. All right, so finally, did we find evidence of a framing effect and shifts in risk disposition, and did that have an impact on deterrence judgments? And I guess the answer is you betcha. Just as an aside here, we're kind of describing a three-way interaction. There are lots of ways to model these data and present them. For us, simpler is better. This table just has the proportions of subjects who selected escalation in the gains frame and in the loss frame. And across the rows, we have those scores for novice and experienced decision makers. There's some simple statistical tests. And then we have, in this final column here, percent change, which is kind of an effects magnitude measure for us. And what we found here was actually kind of interesting. First, and the red are statistically significant results. First, reframing fundamentally alters deterrence decision making. As we move from the domain of gains to the domain of losses, we see statistically significant, but also if you look at that far right column, substantively meaningful shifts, increases in escalatory behavior. Second, it appears that advanced education in strategy combined with military experience doesn't inoculate decision makers against framing effects, which we've kind of found to be an interesting result. In fact, if you look at it, across all domains, the framing effect sizes were greater in the military sample than in the novice sample. The shift in preference that we get is greater for experts. And we might have an explanation for this, but we'll hold that for a moment. Okay, so there's a lot to sort of drill down. Conflict domain. I apologize. This was actually interesting as well. So we find evidence of framing effects in nuclear, cyber, and the one chemical. We find no evidence of a framing effect in conventional. So as we move from conventional out to more exotic forms of conflict, the risk of framing or reframing, the impact of framing is greater. It looks like, for what we know well, we don't see any evidence of framing there. And so that'll tell us a little bit about multi-domain deterrence in a moment. Okay, so there's a lot there. We want to drill down a bit into the issue of experience, and we'll talk about this as well in the conclusion. But we've rotated the data set here to ask the question, how does experience affect risk preferences? And so what we're looking for here are differences between experts and novices across all of our experimental conditions. Interesting story again, we think. First, novices or inexperienced actors are generally more risk acceptant than experts across domains under gains framing. In addition, novices are more risk acceptant than experienced actors under loss framing, but not in, in nuclear, but not in the other two domains. So taken by itself, that's not so interesting, but if we combine it with the previous slide, we start to get an interesting kind of nuanced understanding of the role of experience on decision making. Experience matters, just not in the way we had initially anticipated. Experienced decision makers are actually less risk acceptant. They're more conservative in their initial judgments. But this lower initial baseline in risk tolerance, right, is undone when you reframe them. So if you reframe experts in losses, they tend to look more like inexperienced decision makers. So they start with a lower baseline, but at the end of the day, if they focus on losses, they look like everybody else. Finally, domain. This surprised us a bit as well. We don't see much of an effect, a domain-specific effect on risk tolerance or risk judgments. We'll talk about nuclear in just a second. The only significant result we saw was kind of puzzling. It's in this bottom quadrant here. So for inexperienced decision makers operating in a loss frame, they actually escalate more in nuclear compared to conventional and cyber, not less. Zach sort of suggested earlier on that there's a fair bit of debate and argument about whether or not nuclear is different. We think it actually is different, but again, maybe not in the way that we had initially expected. If you look at this slide in isolation, nuclear doesn't look all that different. But if you combine it with the previous slide, we start to get, again, a slightly different picture. This is that first slide. If you notice, the framing effects for both novices and experts were greatest in nuclear. The story about nuclear might not be how our fear of catastrophic consequences produces caution and stability. Sort of the proponents of the nuclear taboo make a version of this argument. The story about nuclear might be how that same fear of catastrophic consequences calcifies loss frames, produces instability in a relationship that sometimes can be rather horrific to contemplate. Look, when decision makers frame nuclear deterrence options exclusively in terms of losses, right, we get the largest frame shift across domains. And for inexperienced decision makers who do that, we see what was for us the largest proportion of folks who selected escalation. So novice decision makers operating in loss frames in nuclear represent the greatest risks. Okay, so very briefly, sort of back out. What did we find? We find strong evidence for the impact of reframing. Just like we do in every other domain of human behavior, reframing on losses affects our risk disposition, even in the deterrence context. Experience matters. Experienced decision makers start out as somewhat more cautious, but there's nothing about experience that inoculates these decision makers against cognitive bias and frame-induced risk shifts. With respect to domain, it looks like framing and experience matter more than domain. We also looked at, as Zach mentioned, inherent risk disposition. We measured this a couple of ways, and threat clarity. And it turns out we didn't find very much. So we measured inherent disposition a couple of different ways. It doesn't appear to affect susceptibility to framing. It doesn't appear to affect baseline risk preferences in deterrence once you control for framing. So there are other ways to measure sort of who we are internally with respect to risk, but as best we can tell right now, there's not a lot there. We also looked at threat clarity, ambiguous versus clear threats, and we didn't find much. There is some evidence in our data that issuing another threat, a follow-on threat, is perceived as escalatory. It doesn't really matter how you say it. The more often you say it, you're perceived as threatening, and that may bring with it some escalation risks. We're not sure about that. There's some noise in the data, so we don't want to push that result too far. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it back to Zach. He's going to talk a little bit about the policy implications, and then hopefully we've given you enough for to think about for a discussion.
We could have done a literal high five to pass the baton. Okay, so what I want to do is connect all of the really interesting stuff that Jeff had just said to drivers of deterrence stability, right? So how does this zooming in on decision makers and what's going on between our brains affect a lot of the stuff that as international relations scholars we look at in terms of how states behave? And the one big takeaway is we now have demonstrated that risk preferences in the deterrence domain can shift without respect to facts on the ground. And the big implication of this is that a dominant strand of thinking about deterrence is that deterrence outcomes, probability of stability, instability, success, or failure from a US perspective, is often driven by consideration of relative stakes, right? If the United States has a lot at stake relative to the adversary, we're more committed, we'll have a more credible threat, more effective deterrence, more stable relationship. And in the opposite case, the adversary wants it more, stakes are higher for them than they are for us, then we're going to suffer from a commitment problem, credibility problem, stability problem. What we've seen here is that when the stakes are favoring stability or instability, we can still have risk shifts. And this is sort of good news and bad news. The good news is a lot of those situations where we think the stakes favor the adversary, and so they are not open to deterrence, and so we have to start working on warfighting options, deterrence may still be able to work. We need to work on reframing in those situations. The opposite is some situations where we think stability is pretty good. It's hardwired into the stakes of the game, and that if everyone understands the stakes, they understand that failure is worse than maintaining this relationship, we don't have to worry about failure. And we show that it can still be the same, and without any change in the stakes, without any change in the costs to deterrence failure, you can have risky escalatory behavior. So let's drill down on that a little bit. This new danger presented by loss frames. Inexperienced, experienced, doesn't matter. So a lot of these relationships with experienced adversaries, say Russia or China, where we think they understand the stakes, we understand the stakes, it'll be bad for both folks. We can do a lot, perhaps lean on capabilities, lean on aggressive language, because the relationship is hardwired to be stable based on the stakes. That may not be the case. These experienced leaders can also engage in loss frames and have risky behavior. The US, as an implication, needs to be cognizant about the capacity of decision makers in this country of shifting into loss frame thinking, where the threat environment doesn't change, the stakes don't change, but we start thinking we need to send what is objectively unnecessarily risky signals. And then to foot stomp on Jeff's point about the nuclear domain and experience, when we're in situations where we have inexperienced leaders and nuclear use is on the table, loss frames matter the most based on our data. As an implication of this, recent events where we saw leaders using a lot of loose language, and I'd say a lot of the conventional wisdom among those who know in foreign policy said, words are words, language is language, but at the end of the day, these folks know what's at stake, and this language is just sort of side theater that the media is paying attention to. We have some data here that shows maybe that's not the case. We don't exactly know what language shifts one into loss frames to make risky decisions, but we know that language does matter, and it particularly matters when the leader doesn't have a lot of military experience and when nuclear use is on the table. So after that gloom and doom, shifting gears to new opportunities, we've provided a new causal logic for why assurances, inducements, positive language can be a stabilizing force. Right? So I think that in our conversations with military folks, there was a concern voiced maybe at the beginning of this project that typically when you discuss using inducements and assurances as part of crisis bargaining, that a strong voice in the room is that that will be seen as appeasement. That during this eyeball-to-eyeball brinkmanship scenario, when we issue some sort of positive signal, we're going to be communicating weakness, undermining our credibility, and subsequently undermining stability. We haven't shown, what we've shown is not that that's wrong, right? We haven't invalidated that, but we've shown that it can also lead to stability. And then we have to think about that opportunity when we're looking at overall deterrence bargaining. In particular, this question right now, as the United States is in the middle of a reinvestment and development process with its nuclear, but cyber and conventional as well, the pursuit of these capabilities in current national security documents is seen as a way of, across domains and across adversaries, a way of increasing our credibility and stability. What we've shown today is yes and no. Context matters. It depends on how the adversaries are processing the risks, whether they're loss framed or gains framed. So as an implication, what this shows is minimally, if we're into pursuing lower yield, higher accuracy nuclear weapons on a range of delivery systems in conjunction with more offensive cyber capabilities, increasing our conventional force structure investments, those need to happen in concert with trying to avoid loss framing by adversaries minimally, and optimally happen in tandem with efforts to lock in gains frames. Okay, so future research here. What we want to do next is take this show on the road. Basically take this US-based model that we've developed and do a cross-national version of it. So today, what we have is a good baseline understanding of this causal framework that I mentioned at the outset of our study. We now know that decision makers in the deterrence context are frameable, right? And we have some good understandings of the contextual factors that affect the degree to which they are frameable. And we would expect this to hold cross-nationally. But what we don't know is how specific, nation-specific contextual factors affect that. Culture, history. A nuclear use is probably going to be different in countries that don't have the weapons or that have experienced a nuclear detonation than they are in our country. We don't exactly know how those contextual factors affect things. We expect that the relationship perhaps between domain, experience, threat clarity would vary to some degree across countries. And we want to fine-tune that by expanding the study. Ultimately, once we start getting a handle on the effect of the nation-specific decision-making context, then we can start working on these two long-term policy products. We can get at leading indicators of when states are about to shift into loss frames. So what is the blinking red light for loss frame shifts? And once we can zero in on maybe one or two conditions, then we can start devising counterframing strategies. In other areas, counterframing has been demonstrated to work. We can, in many cases, it's been couched as making decision-making more rational by simply offering people both frames simultaneously. But whatever the case may be, we can avoid the loss framing that leads to unnecessary escalation, perhaps, by counterframing once we know what is behind the frames driving the adversary's decisions. With that, I'm going to open up to questions. I really look forward to hearing what you guys have to say. Thank you.